Thank you so much for accepting the being to be interviewed by me and to show up on our show. I love the work you've been doing with the archive. So I'd like to know a little bit more about you, how you got started into games, computers, and then we can go on to your current work at the archive.
Yeah, yeah, awesome. Well, thank you for the compliment. So my name is Willem Hilhorst. I am from the Netherlands. I'm currently about 27 years old. I've always had a fascination for games as a hobby, as a playtime, spare time, whatever you want to call it. But it's always been there from a very young age. So having an attachment to that, but also film and music, like media in general, was always my go-to escapism. Uh, and games really connected with me because of their interactivity. I actually, like, while I did play a lot of computer games when I was a lot younger, my dad had a fairly powerful computer. He was not really into games or so, or none of my family members were. So I started out with a lot of educational titles on PC. But when I really started playing video game myself was when we got a GameCube for Christmas, and I believe it was 2006, no, 2004, something around that time. And that's when I really started getting into games as a way to spend my time after school. And an interesting story I tend to tell with that is that I it used to be my parents were very busy. They had very busy jobs, so we had a sort of nanny staying at our place, an au pair, and she came from South Africa. So we had a hard time talking to one another because she spoke mostly English with a little bit of Dutch, but the games were all in English that we played. So I started to teach English to myself through her because she was looking up guides for Ocarina of Time and then translating them to me, and that's sort of how I learned my English, but also how I grew into games as a medium, as an entertainment. Um, so still, it was still a hobby. And then years down the road, I started to specialize, especially in film production and film studies, media studies. But then game studies came on my path, and I was really like, oh, I want to do more with video games. And when I did a master's in journalism, I realized I was the only journalist in the room, full of a room of expert investigative journalists, like people that really want to win Pulitzer prizes, right? Really want to be the best of journalism. And there was one question about games, and they were all sitting there like not being able to tell anything about games. And I was like, I found my niche. I can do my game studies combination with journalism. I became a games researcher in that sense, which is very hard to do in the Netherlands because it's such a small country, and also there's not really like a really proper video game journalism install base here. There's a few outlets, but nothing really substantial like in the US or the UK. So I kind of rolled into this work when I realized, like, hey, I want to do more with that researching for games. I started working at Sound and Vision, mostly for the new museum, which is has a space dedicated to video games. And then I also learned more about our archival efforts on video games, and was like, that's perfect. I want to help with that. So that's kind of how I ended up here, and I've been working here for over 3 years now, and it's fun. It's great times.
So how is the current uh, magazine scene in the regarding video games in the Netherlands? Are there still printed magazines being edited over there? Did you ever consider working for one of those magazines if if you could?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, we still have one dedicated print magazine for video games, which is called Power Unlimited. It is still being published, printed on a monthly basis. They work mostly with freelancers and a shifting cast of like. They started back in 1993 originally, and they've grown. So they're around for over 30 years now. And what they really set them apart is what they were part of the first wave of personality-based video game journalism. So they are really just like the faces, the journalists themselves are very much part of the sales pitch. And back in the early days, it was really marketed towards like young boys and like very teenager, very edgy, not always that suitable for younger audiences, but it was like the main magazine you would be able to get. And over the years, they shifted, they adapted to the times, thankfully. And now, yeah, now it's the only magazine in the rec you'll find that's directly in Dutch. Most of all the competition have either dissolved over time or changed to just an online format. And if I wanted to be part of that, yeah, I mean, honestly, I did kind of look into it, but since they're mostly based in freelancing, I didn't consider myself to be, properly well versed enough to start a full career of freelancing. So for me, it was also like shifting towards writing about games online. I did that for a Dutch publication called N1 Up. I did that for about 2, 3 years ish. It was a lot of fun. And I'm still writing for an English-based website called Nintendo World Report because my background and interests have always been Nintendo. But yeah, it's really. It's in the Netherlands, especially. It's really difficult unless you also want to broaden out to like tech and lifestyle, and that is really some parts that I don't feel qualified to write about. So yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, actually, the we have some of those magazines that rather give Power Unlimited. Power Unlimited, is it?
Yes.
Yeah, strangely, those magazines can also be found for sale here in Portugal, and I was kind of
Really?
surprised
Wow.
to know about that. So, and regarding the archive, is the video game preservation part a very recent thing for them? Because I know that this started as a archive for the radio and the television, right?
Yes, yes. Our national. So we're the Netherlands Institute of Sound and Vision. We were founded in 2006, I want to say, or 2004. We were founded, and we were kind of like a collection of different broadcasting archives. So all for Dutch television and radio in the Netherlands, which is really cool. And then in 2006, we opened a museum, which was all about nostalgia. And then in 2007, the iPhone released, and like all media was like all upended by one single invention. And we like to take the long approach, but around 2000, I want to say 2014, 13, 15, we realized, yeah, okay, this new digital media, we need to do something with that. And that's kind of when the seeds were planted to start video game preservation, as well as our web archive and our web video archive. So we do a lot of different archival stuff here. And it's all focused on the Netherlands or an explicit connection with Dutch culture or Dutch creators. So that's like our scope in that sense. And actively video game preservation, yeah, I always say we started around 2017. That's when the first real partners came on board, and our methodology was kind of like started. And yeah, that's been the kickoff for what we call the Dutch video game canon, which is for us a leading tool in naming some important Dutch cultural games.
So, and do you have any physical items, or is this archive exclusively concerned with the digital part?
Yeah, so our focus is primarily digital, and that is also because we consider that to be the best and most effective long form of preservation. Our perspective is that games are inherently digitally created, so it makes the most sense to preserve them in a digital form. In 20 to 50 years, very few people will be able to repair and maintain a PlayStation 1, just to name an example. So we want to be ahead of that curve and focus exclusively on digital. But we do get physical items from donations and people that we work with. So, for example, a couple of weeks ago, we had a lovely donation from Two Tribes, which is a studio that created Tokitori. And they also, when they after they made Tokitori and they had their company, they also had like physical merch. So we have like a little plush of Tokitori itself and a T-shirt and a couple of the physical games too. But like that's for us the exception and mostly used to like represent the video games in our archive in our depots.
Sure. And do you do exhibits, or is the archive open to the public? How does it
Yes,
work?
yeah. So games are a bit challenging in that sense. Like as an archive, we are open to the public. We have both a physical portal that people can use to look through our metadata, but as with any archive, rights and rights holders is the important thing. So we do not own anything legally that is donated to us. We are mainly guarding a big treasure chest, and the treasure chest is filled with all these cool things. But if you want to use the treasure chest, you have to ask us, and we ask the people responsible if you can reuse it. But access is always available here. For the video games, that's something we've been kind of like experimenting with because we want to kind of set up a dedicated place where people can play the games and we can offer the games in playable form. But it is still something we're examining. Also, because a lot of researchers aren't still aware of that we do this, which is kind of difficult because everyone associates us with radio and television. So telling, oh, also we do games, but we're not an arcade. You can't just go in here and play all those games. You have to do a archival or research request. That kind of makes it challenging to communicate that to the outside world. But yes, if we have a historian or a researcher or an educator who wants to say, well, I want to study this game and see how it was created or learn how to play it, we can certainly facilitate that if it is within our collection and within our scope. Yes.
Interesting. So, and recently on the US, I know that there was a lot of talk about uh, how games should be made available at the archives for researchers, and apparently publishers and the developers, I think, aren't much aren't very fond of that idea. They're afraid that it might hurt sales. So, I don't know, can you tell me how is does that work legally over there?
Yeah, yeah. So, what's interesting is that we don't just, yeah, like I said, we work with donations, so we are depending on what people give us. With video games in particular, we always do our research to find the current rights holder of the game, and we explain to them what the goal is of our archive, and they need to sign off on it. So, if the rights are still with the original creators, that is usually a developer. They are tend to be understanding. It could also be with a major publisher, either within the Netherlands or abroad. And then it's more challenging because you want to explain that whole archive aspect of it and make it accessible, but also like we are not an arcade, right? People just don't come up and play our collection, so to speak. So that takes time, that takes messaging. We do feel that on a legal front, we are very well embedded. Also, we're not dealing with U.S. Copyright law and archival and library access laws, so we're more European Netherlands focused. For those who are unaware, there's not a deposit law in the Netherlands. So unlike France, for example, where every game that is published on French soil, it has to go to an archive. That is not something that happens in the Netherlands. So we have to do the hard work here. But whenever we explain this to people, people tend to be very accommodating. The technical and the accessible, like what do you need to get, what do we need to give you? That is usually the process that takes the longest time because you have to go through multiple people, and you're an archivist, right? You're the last in line. You come at the very end of a development cycle or long after the development cycle is gone. So most people don't have the project immediately on their mind, so it's really like a messaging thing of remember that thing you did 20 years ago, maybe we should preserve that. And they are like, I can't remember I worked on that, or oh, you are interested in this educational game I made on a weekend. Okay, what do you need? And that's kind of what takes time. I think what we do can help the achievements of making video games more accessible in libraries and that sort of thing. But since we are already an archive, we have a bit of a weird position in that sense.
Okay, and this might be a very complicated question, but I'd also like to know a little bit about the history of video games in the Netherlands, mainly game development. And so, could you tell us a few of the more, I know, the more important titles, the ones that are the most known nowadays? Probably have been playing Dutch video games and we don't even know about it.
Yeah, exactly. So I think to launch that specific question of you, I'd like to if your watchers or readers or listeners are interested, we have the Dutch Games Canon, as I said before. This is like an interactive website we created where we list all these important games for the Netherlands, and the list was not created by us, but we had experts flown in, come by train to us to tell us about the games from the Netherlands that are the most important. And I think that's when you look at that list, we don't make the distinction between like serious or applied games and entertainment games, right? We have a very wide scope in that sense. So I think one of the most notable developers from the Netherlands has always been Radarsoft. Radarsoft was founded in the mid 1980s as a Commodore 64 developer mostly. They were mostly active by two developers, John van der Aert and oh no, the other name is escaping me. Well, John van der Aert is at least one of the most important figures in that, and they created a bunch of titles on home computers, and they kind of grew from like these hobbyists to a well-established publisher in the 1980s for home computers and later on, I think, microcomputers as well. they made a surprising amount of both educational titles and entertainment titles. So, for example, there's Topography Netherlands, but also Topography Europe, and this was distributed all across Europe, as far as we know. So we found German versions, we found, I think, French and Italian versions as well. Like they had really had a network for distribution for these little cassette tapes. That was just basically teaching kids and adults geography, right, topography, where are certain places located. Um, so that's one of the major ones from the early 80s. Now, if you look to the 90s, then you can talk about developers like Davilex. Davilex is a studio that made for people my generation. They're mostly well known for educational titles with a mascot called Red Cat, which was simply a red cat that went on all these educational adventures. But this came around a time that the government in the Netherlands was really pushing to have more computers in classrooms. And with that, they also wanted educational software to kind of teach children how to use a computer. And Davilex really created budget bin titles, so to speak, but they were very entertaining and they all had this red cat and this very specific type of box. So everyone recognized Red Cat at a certain point, and that really began their claim to fame because they originally started as a management like executive suite, right? They made Excel-like programs or administrative software, but their games division grew really quickly, really popularly, and they were based in Utrecht in the Houten. So they made Red Cat. They were also responsible for like making the A2 Racer series, which was the first game where you could really race on the Dutch highways through cities. It is quite primitive when looking at it, and also it doesn't play that great. But seeing the Netherlands accurately represented, at least culturally accurate, is really something that hasn't been done since in a lot of games, which I find really interesting as a sort of cultural artifact. So the Davilex was really for a lot of people who grew up with games in the 90s, like the founding father for Dutch games, though the history is much older than that. And then if you talk about the modern era, what grew out of Davilex games had to dissolve by the early 2000s, and main creators there split away to form different companies. And one of the important companies there was Lost Boys Interactive. And they also had multiple several divisions like Formula Games and also other types of software. And all these splinter groups that grew out of Davilex, they kind of realigned later on at the early mid 2000s when they formed Guerrilla Games, and that is still our major game company in the Netherlands. That is the biggest studio we have. It's Sony owned currently by PlayStation, and they created originally the Killzone series, but also currently they're well known for the Horizon Zero Dawn and Forbidden West games. These are like high-end triple A productions with millions of dollars investments, and they are sort of they've become our flagship. I read that when Horizon Zero Dawn was originally released in 2017, it was the highest export we ever had in the Netherlands of a product, and in terms of pure sales, it eclipsed our tulip exports, like our national flower
Oh,
exports. It
interesting.
just surpassed that. And when you look at that, like it makes sense because obviously a game is much more expensive for a consumer to buy than a tulip. But also like that was something where video games have an economic value, and like I don't need to tell you or your audience that, but within the Netherlands, suddenly it was like, oh, there's our major power player, and they're based in Amsterdam. They're still going strong, and yeah, it's one of the more notable games on our from our product from our country. Yeah.
Hmm. I was checking something here because. uh, okay. Uh, Actually, isn't the Blob a Dutch game?
Yes, yes, very well. Like the blob is interesting in that sense. So for those of you who don't know, the blob is a game where it was developed for the Wii, where you have to wave your remote around and you could splat buildings in different colors, and you have to go through this action adventure puzzle game. What is interesting is the concept was originally developed on three points. On one point, it was developed by students from the Utrecht School for the Arts, which is one of our main game study educational tracks in the Netherlands, in collaboration with the province of Utrecht, as well as the founding of the Dutch Game Garden, which like three major institutions in the field of games. And basically, what the municipality of Utrecht wanted, they wanted like a sort of concept that could show how the city of Utrecht could evolve over time. Like, how can we make it more fun to think about what the future of Utrecht holds? So these students were given this assignment, and they made this game where you go around with a little like squishy figure and you color in Utrecht, and that's kind of like based on this on the reworks plan of how they wanted to change the city of Utrecht. But it was a really fun game, and you could play it on your computer. Can't recall if it was created in Flash per se, but it was something along that. So it was very accessible, and they, thanks to the Dutch Game Garden and the School for the Arts, they sent out this pitch to at the time THQ, and THQ was very interested. So as far as I know, they got the concept, they bought the rights from the concept from those students, from the municipality and the School of the Arts. So let's all collaborated into one, and it was sold to THQ, and then THQ made the Blob themselves, separate from the students. But the students were still very much like the core origin of that. And those students then went on to form Ronimo Studios, which created the game Awesome Knots and also Swords and Soldiers, which is a fairly popular Wii game and franchise at the time. Unfortunately, the studio went bankrupt last year, but yeah, it's really fun how those things all roll together, and the Blob is still very much a cult hit for many players.
So yeah, when I think of Dutch games, the Blob comes immediately to mind because I remember playing the game originally for the PC as still a student game and covering all the buildings. It was the first time I had ever heard about Dutch games. And then when I saw the game for sale for the Wii, well, of course I had to buy, and I loved it. And oh, it's an amazing game, and the music is also great. I think
So good.
they did great work, picking up that great idea and expanding it.
Yeah, exactly. And also, like, it's still, I like that they retained the Dutch name for the game, like the Blob.
Yes,
It's
yes.
the way you would say it in Dutch as well. So I don't know. It's something when you look at it, you're still like, yeah, that makes sense. It all clicks, right?
Mm. I also remember hearing about the these Devil X games through, I think it was N Brass, because he also has a Dutch games collection, and he very proudly shows the stuff he has. So I think he was the first person who actually told me about these games.
Yeah, he's a very well known collector here, and he has all the games in the big box version. A couple of years ago, he actually found the original version of Red Cat. Because Red Cat, before he became an educational mascot, he was like a little 2D platformer game where he was wearing like a bread pan and also holding a gun and shooting animals in the game. It was a very different type of platformer. And that was before they kind of retooled it to make Red Cat the mascot of the educational series. But those original Red Cat games are very hard to find. And I remember he was texting me a year or so ago, like, I found it at like a local charity shop, which was very cool to read. Yeah.
No, that's very cool. Well, and right now I
Yeah.
think he has his collection on the Home Computer Museum. So
Yes,
if
yes, very much worth the visit. If you're ever in the Netherlands and you go to Helmond, those folks really know their computers, and they're such a dedicated group of people and enthusiasts. Like, their work is mostly in preserving hardware, so it's kind of out of our scope. But I'm so glad that like the director of the museum, Bart, is taking up that mantle and really keeping that aspect of Dutch games culture and history very strong.
hmm. Well, okay, picking up a subject from before, if a person wanted to have access to well, one of the games in your archive, but not physically, would that be possible without actually
Yeah,
traveling
so
there?
Unfortunately, at the time, remote access is still unavailable for the games themselves, as in playable form. We are trying to make the metadata public, as well as do our own video capture and screenshots capture, as well as like a very selected information of metadata on contextual documents, as we call them. But currently, also because we want to kind of be sure that the rights holders can trust us and that there's no like issue about someone accessing a game for remotely. We still are not in a position to do that at the moment. Who can say in the future? It's also what is important to keep in mind is like our archive started originally as a radio and television archive. So a lot of the underlying infrastructure that we are building on is still based in that background. So there's no, the archive only accepts very specific types of data, and you have to think about how access works for a video file comparatively to an interactive video game file. Like that is something that we internally still need to work out as we are also maintaining and growing this library of accessible titles. So for the moment, unfortunately, only on our location. But we hope that with the access of video, gameplay, and screenshot, we can still provide an insight in how these games look and play.
Yeah, I think that might be enough. And well, there is a lot of other ways to access these games, but okay, we won't mention that.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly. And also, I think like as far as like our vision of this project is like as an archive, you are looking towards the future. Some are looking like 10, 50 years. We are looking at a vision of 200 years. So it's really for us as well, like throwing a dart into a black hole and seeing where it ends up. We don't know, but that's why we're trying to make these wide shots and then see how we can narrow down our vision and make it more precise over time. And I think that's important for an archive to also take these leaps and see where you end up, see who has notes, see what people need, see how people feel. Like at the moment, people don't come to us yet for the video games, right? But we are certain that in 20 years, that will happen for sure. So maybe by that time, we can be more prepared to have that remote access as well.
okay. On a more personal level, what is the area that interests you the most? Is it advertising, games? I don't know, games marketing, games developed in the Netherlands. What what's your area of interest?
Yeah, for me, it's people. It's genuinely the people that create these works. From like my work perspective, it is talking to the developers that worked on these projects, but also localizers, marketeers that tell stories about how these projects all came together or didn't come together. Right? There's a lot of that's always left on the cutting room floor, and getting insights into those is something I find very fascinating. But because it tells you something about how people change and in turn how culture of development change. How does a country become a professional powerhouse in the games industry internationally, or in the the current malaise we're seeing, like the recession and studios having to close down. Like last week we lost two very prominent Dutch game studios, Keoken Interactive that was active for about 7 years, as well as Paladin Studios that was active for 19 years. How do you tell the story of the people that work there, and not just like the titles are what brings us together, but I think that as a person or as a cultural institute, you have to tell the story of the people, and that's something I try to do in my personal work, in my work here. I really want to make sure that those people are acknowledged as well as their story can be told outside of the game, because I'm pretty sure the games will live on. Like people will always gravitate towards the games, but how do you make someone really connect to a title? I think that's people.
Yes, and I will agree with you. That's why I also started to do these interviews.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah. So that interests me, and like on a more game specific level, I love games where the mechanics are absurd and weird and try to make you think about what it means to be a player. So many games gravitate towards the safe choices, like picking up a controller, having an A button to attack and a B button to jump. Like that is very safe. It can work on so many levels, but I like games that try to look at how can we work with a player, or how can we think about that. Like a great example, I think, that is also Dutch, is from the creator Adriaan de Jong. He has made a lot of weird games, and he would describe them himself as weird. And one of them is a game called Bounden, which is kind of like a version of Twister, the board game where you have this mat with all these colors where you have to put your hands and feet down. But you play it on an iPad, and you have to do it with your fingers. And you also kind of make connections with the player while playing it. And it's such a different approach to what play means. I really like that sort of thing. So yeah, that's the whenever I come across one of those, or developers like, I have this weird peripheral that you need to play my game. Where you have a game in our archive actually called Underground, which was an entertainment game for the Wii U, but it was also designed as an educational tool for people that perform operations in a hospital. So you have this big setup with like two claw grips that you have to scoop around in, and when you do so on the game screen, you see these drills coming out in caves, and you have to remove boulders and obstacles to guide robots to the end of a level. It is a weird method of play, and it takes a really long time to get used to it. But then again, so it takes learning the skill to operate on humans. So it makes sense, I guess. I'm not that good at it, I should say.
Never heard about that game. Was that something available to the general public, or something used for the specific training?
No, they sold the version with the accessories on their website, both for the US and Europe. With the closure of the Wii U, they stopped supporting it because obviously it cannot be run in that sense anymore. And you can also play the game without the accessory setup. But I feel that the accessory tells the story of like what the goal was, and there was also a research paper attached to it, like why does this method work or what are its shortcomings, which is something I find very fascinating to learn about.
Oh, okay, oh, that's very cool.
Yeah.
uh, I wish I could play that game. I had never heard about it. And it's very important that you are preserving these items. You know, not only the digital part, but also the physical items, the joysticks, the peripherals, and whatnot.
Yeah, for D titles especially because it is part of that story you're trying to tell, and like for we don't preserve like every Nintendo Wii or every Nintendo system you can imagine, but these accessories that are tied to the development and the creation of a game, I think, are very much worthwhile to archive and preserve here. Yeah.
And do you only preserve games that are made in the Netherlands, or do you have some other releases, other things from other
So
countries?
yeah. So our real focus selection criteria is based on the Netherlands. That is partly to do because we are funded by the Dutch government, so it is legally our task to focus on the Netherlands. That does mean that we can also like there is a bit of a range there. You can say games that are developed in the Netherlands. Well, okay, look at Guerrilla Games. Most of their employees are not from the Netherlands; they are international. How Dutch is Guerrilla Games as a studio? That's a fair question to ask, but we still consider it Dutch because of its history, but also it is based in Amsterdam, and it's very much Dutch in its approach to game design. I think that's a safe bet. We also look at certain creators. For example, Arjen Brusset is the creator of Jazz Jackrabbit, but he went on to help work at Epic Mega Games, which is now Epic Games, where he is also playing a role in the Unreal Engine. So then you can kind of wind in that scope like, okay, do you want to preserve Fortnite then? No, that's probably too big of a reach, and also the technical difficulties are very, very, very large. But it is part of that story, so maybe like having an active, having a version or that, or being able to tell that story. That's not something we're doing right now, but it might be something that we want to do over time. That's the interesting approach there. And then finally, there is the I like this exception, but that's also me being a weird sicko at times. Is the Zelda CDI games are in our Dutch games canon, so they are not developed in the Netherlands, but they are very much emblematic of the Philips CDI as a system and their attempt to get into video games. Especially the history of how those games came together. So, are they Dutch? No. Are they intrinsically linked to Dutch games history? To a certain degree, I'd say it's the first localization we have in the Netherlands of Link and Zelda, which is something that hasn't only, in text, they only started localizing Zelda games here in 2017 with Breath of the Wild. So there was already a game in 1993 where you had Dutch voices for Link and Zelda, which is very fun to read and learn about. But also try to explain this to the current rights holders, like, hey, we want a Zelda game in our Dutch archive. Like they might feel a bit queasy about it.
And I can't believe I almost forgot to mention the CDI. We had Philips really was all in here in Portugal on the CDI. They were promoting it as the next big thing. You would see ads on every newspaper, magazine, possibly even TV. So not sure. I have to research more, but at least in magazines and newspapers they were all over the place. And we had a few titles developed here that never left the country. So yeah, I'm really interested in this weird console and
Yeah,
its history.
we talked to earlier this year. We talked to a few people that were really active in CDI development. They were like Philips' first party studio, so to speak. And the difficulty Philips had was that they weren't necessarily seeing the CDI as like video game console. It was never meant to be a video game console. It was meant to be like the next form of interactive media. It was supposed to be like the precursor to DVD. Or the successor to CD-ROM in a sense, right? Interactive CDs. So what they sold for so far, and I think you can collaborate this, right? They sold encyclopedias, they sold music catalogs, they sold these interactive visualizers, right? It was very much not the next video game system you need to buy, and I think that's because of the Zelda CDI games, Hotel Mario. I think that's like a dominant vision for many people unfamiliar with its background. But it was never meant to be like a competition to the PlayStation or other interactive systems. It was supposed to be like its own different format. One thing we learned, which I found really interesting, is that actually in collaboration with like the in the US you would say the DMV, but where you get your driver's license to take your theoretical driving license exam. So just learning how when to brake, when to stop, who gets to go first on a roundabout. That was all taken through a quiz. You had to go to the CBR, our Dutch equivalent of that, and there you had to play the theoretical exam. You had to do it on a CDI. They had 30 of these CDI systems built into TVs, and they used it for almost 20 years, I've been told, to take your theoretical exam using a CDI. And no one knew it was a CDI, but it was. Philips had these strategic deals where it would be used in educational tools that were much beyond the scope of video games, right? And that's also the interesting thing about it, and also the downfall, right? You're such a niche. You're also not really the next format. CD advancements were so quick. The CDI was a flop in general. I think it's fair to say that still. But Philips doesn't want to talk about it nowadays anymore. There's an official Philips museum in Eindhoven, and they do not mention the CDI anywhere whatsoever. The most complete CDI collection you'll find in the Netherlands is actually at the HomeComputerMuseum in Helmond because they have a full collection there. But yeah, it's such an obscure machine that had such a massive impact, but no one has really delved into like lining out its entire history, and we only have very good snippets and anecdotes of other people that were there and active on it. But I feel it's still something to mine, and especially I mean I'm learning it now that in Portugal it was also very active. Like I'm kind of curious how the CDI spread throughout Europe, and like I can tell the Dutch story, but I can't tell the story elsewhere.
Yeah, I think Philips had a very strong presence here. First, because they introduced the MSX format to Portugal, and the first MSX computers were introduced by Philips, and there was a lot of advertising around that. And then with the Philips CDI, I still have to study more of this history, but at least in advertising, I know they did a lot for the MSX, and they released the VG 8000, and all the subsequent models. But we didn't get MSX2 as far as I know. And
Yeah,
then
but like what I was saying earlier about those in the 90s, like PCs coming into the classroom. I've been told every technology ever developed or ever released in the Netherlands has some connection to Philips. Like it is undeniable how deep their connections were to either government policy or technological releases. Like all our cameras in our depots downstairs have some sort of connection to Philips when they were developed. Like it is such an integral part of talking about Dutch culture, working culture, technology development. But yeah, they were everywhere, and so many of their projects and patents have failed over time. It's crazy. But also, they're still around, so I guess they're doing something right.
yeah, I wish they would be able to talk a little bit more about the CDI. Maybe there's still hurts about the how the system failed. Yeah, but so I was mentioning, yes, we had very there was a very strong bet in the CDI, but it is more sort of a kind of a multimedia computer equivalent, mixed with a DVD player, and the majority of what I find here are movies and a few interactive things like encyclopedias and stuff like that. But well, well, now that you're talking about this, I think the biggest thing that at least regarding advertising was that the album released by Pedro Abrunhosa was a pretty big thing back then, and they were promoting it as the first video game made for the CDI in Portugal, but it wasn't like a game. It's more like an music album. It had the music, the video clips, and it had like an interactive quiz. But everywhere it was promoted like the first game. It was like it was a very big thing. And then we had some educational titles and stuff about Lisbon and Portugal. And we had a studio working with CDI. With it. They actually had some dev kits and everything, and they were, at least according to what I've read, one of the very few selected studios in the world to be an official CDI developer. So they actually ended up doing kind of the same things you did over there. Regarding
That's really cool.
contracts with they had some contracts with companies and the government, and and stuff like presentations, for the Ministry of Agriculture, or about fishing, and I don't know, all kinds of random things, presentations in interactive programs, all stuff like that. And I think that was the only way they could sustain the Philips CDI development. They tried doing games, but didn't work out. They also tried to do an encyclopedia, but the project never went forward. So it was only through this government and company connection that they. Oh yeah, and they did something for Renault, the French car brand, I think. Also something for internal, only to be distributed by to employers. There is a lot of story around this that I still need to to research.
And also there's so much, right? Like it was fun. A couple of weeks ago, I was at an unrelated event. It had some connection to games, but not explicitly. And I'm talking to someone that is visiting our booth because we're standing there to promote our archive work. And they start talking about their work. And I say, well, I do video game preservation at our institute. And they're like, oh, really? Do you have the CDI? And I'm like, yeah, of course we have a CDI. She said, oh, I worked on CDI development back at the early 90s. And we did the first interactive shopping catalogs for like C&A and big store brands. And they actually had a CD-ROM where you could browse through their catalog to purchase things. I was like, oh my God, I didn't even know that was a possibility. That makes total sense that they would try to do that. Like, so I'm trying to reach out to them and also see like how does this work and what was their role in it. It's very cool to like slowly piece together bit by bit what it's all about. Yeah.
Yeah, I see. So these things are not exactly games, but I still think they should be preserved. I don't know what's your stance over there on the archive, but I hope you're also preserving these interactive media things.
Like when there's such an explicit connection to the CDI, it's easier to say it also falls under there. We do look at other types of interactive media preservation. So we do have a couple of people that are trying to learn more about how to preserve XR, AR, and VR. Right, all those interactive types of installations, art projects. I think one of them is like an extra interactive art project they did on Instagram. So how do you preserve that? How do you make that visible? Which is something I know nothing about, but it's very good that other people are also looking at stuff beyond games here.
Okay, this has nothing to do with games, but I'm curious. So the Sound and Vision archive was the union of several archives, I think, all over the country. And so did you are the physical archives of TV and radio still, well, I'm not sure how much you have of the radio, but at least I bet on the TV part you must still have a lot of stuff. Did you bring everything into this one building, or are things still separated over various
That's a good question, actually.
places?
Like, Interesting. So as far as I know, and I'm not the main expert on this, but we are most of the stuff is down here in our depots. Like we have 5 floors below ground with depots. About I would argue about 50 depots or something along that kind. That contains vinyl records. That contains radio broadcasts. That contains commercials shot on film. That contains sound archives, like people going to clock towers and having those sounds recorded. We have those all stored downstairs. A lot of them are digitized, not all of them, because that just takes a lot of work. Um, and that is kind of like our the heart of our physical archive is still like trying to save and preserve negatives whenever able, because those are really like if you still have a negative, right, of an original film, you can still upscale those. You can still re-release them in high resolutions if that becomes available over time. One of the interesting collections we have is the Polygoon Journaal. Polygoon were like the Dutch television broadcast in front of movie theaters, right? So you get a little bit of a newsreel before you started watching a movie with a very iconic voiceover explaining what was going on in whatever part of the world. Very outdated, but those were actually the oldest parts of our collection are shot on nitrate film. So they are highly flammable and explosive. So they're not kept here, but at a safe location elsewhere in the Netherlands. Because if it were to go up, like we don't want that anywhere near our current depots. And then we also have like our server down here, but also we have a secret backup at another location. So we do try to account for that. But when the all the different broadcast archives merge together, we did get those music recordings. We get that radio recordings and all those broadcasts. We still have those. We still have like the original television recordings whenever able, but also broadcast magazines. We also have scripts. We also have props. Right? It's very broad in all types of materials. So it's not just film canisters and audio spools. It's right also costumes and anything you can probably imagine that has a connection to television and radio. The one exception there is really film. We don't have a lot of films going on. And that is mostly because the I Film Institute, which is based in Amsterdam, it's a different institute. They are fully focused on film, so that kind of makes more sense most of the time.
Interesting. Well, I wish there was an institution like this. I feel that in Portugal everything is still a little bit all over the place.
Yeah,
uh,
the advantage of being a small country and also like having one place where most media was created is here in Hilversum. So it was already based here. So why not go through with it?
well, and now the most important thing probably. So what is how is your day to day life? What is the work you do regularly? How much of it is does it concern video games? Because I think that's not your only focus on the archive.
Yeah, I wish it were, but unfortunately, games are one aspect of what we do at our archive, and also I need other responsibilities because we just don't have the resources. I work in the games team with a total of like 4 people, and that's all shared with other activities, right? So we're just, we're all working together, but it's a small team, very much focused. I also am partly responsible for web video preservation, podcast preservation, and website preservation. So I am in function of really a digital media manager, as they call it here internally. And that means that on a day to day basis, I could be working on reaching out to podcast makers, trying to allow us to license, as we say, the podcast to be preserved in our archive. I also work with websites to make sure to quality control, check the websites that we archive, which is all manually done in that sense, quality control wise, but also like which websites are we selecting. And with web video, I also help with stuff like do we want to archive and preserve live streaming? What would be our approach there? How do we metadata video properly to make sure it's all right connected and findable and accessible? So yeah, I'm kind of in that digital front end space. I tend to spend 2 to 3 days a week on video games exclusively because that's just my own expertise and also part of why the reason why they hired me. So that means like finding out who to reach, finding out who to talk to, working on the actual files. So seeing how we can make them playable, how do we index them, and how do we make sure that people can learn from them. And that is takes up a lot of time. But in the end, when the game is playable, accessible, that makes it all the worthwhile.
Hmm. Are there any current projects that you can tell us about?
Yeah, I have to think a little bit, but uh, I said the one of the projects we got a few months ago at this point was a game developed by an indie game studio from the Netherlands that they have been working for over a decade. So they had a lot of contextual material. So the final release of the game was fairly recent, but they had a lot of research and build up and all these historical angles for this particular title. The game is called Herald, an interactive narrative game, a narrative adventure, I believe, and it's all about history. And it's based. It has a very much a setting in the colonial era, so there's a lot of tension involved there. In how do you want to write this? How do you want to properly research this? Uh, how do you communicate this? And like in that sense, it was so much material over a decade, and it's all digital, so that is kind of easier. But it does really like make you think like, okay, how do we organize it so people can browse through it? Where do we put all the concept art? Where do we put the documentation? What if this stuff is perhaps privacy sensitive? So can we not sell to someone or sell? I say, can we not show to someone without like infringing on their privacy rights? So that's kind of like the like making up what you're working on. The boring answer is I work mostly in spreadsheets, and I am happy when I get to work on the actual games, but that spreadsheet aspect is just as important.
So, and
I hope that satisfies.
oh yes, it's, and what about the future of the archive and your work? What are your goals? What is your dream? What would you like to preserve, work on? Is it an exhibit? Is it something you'd like to save? Uh,
Yeah, so I am internally here not responsible for exhibits. That goes through our curator. So as much as I promote them all the materials we get and what might be interesting, that's for them. That's not for me to decide. But I what I currently hope for is that kind of helping to build a foundational work where games can be seen as cultural heritage, right? So currently we're kind of in this weird transitional state where video games are acknowledged as being economically important and played by a lot of people, but culturally, no one is still thinking like, oh, it belongs in a museum or it's normal to see this sort of thing. And I think that is something that we are really working towards internally here, right? Making sure that people understand the power and value of video games as cultural artifacts. What can you tell about a culture based on video games? How do you make that insightful beyond just playing the game, right? What do you need? Do you need reviews? Do you need responses? Do you need active development documents? That is sort of the chain that I'm most interested in helping formulate right now. So that Dutch game canon I was talking about. How do you make sure that those titles are not just only preserved, but that their cultural value is helping other people realize how important video games are? That's not just no, we don't need the whole Calamero effect, right? We don't need to say like, oh, we're more important than we actually are, right? Look at us being games. We're fair, we matter. That will happen over time. Like people who grow up with games are now getting kids. They know what it means to them. But how do you pass that forward, right? How do you make sure that people understand that? I think that is the proper question that we're going to be wrestling with over the next 5 to 10 years as our archive and also access grows over time.
well,
It
this
was
is. uh,
and I'm hoping I can do 20% of that, but that's what I want to strive for.
That- That's great. But I think all of us in the preservation community are fighting a little bit for that, for the governments, to finally recognize, that video games are culture, video games are important, they should be preserved and they should be on the same level as literature, art, movies, and everything else. And
Exactly.
well, here in Portugal, we're still way behind you, but I'm hoping to learn a little bit also with these interviews and the people I'm connecting with. Maybe soon we can have something like that, an archive here in Portugal, and hopefully we can collaborate in some way.
Yeah, please learn and steal from us. All archives everywhere. And we want to do the same too, right? We're throwing that darts into the black hole. We have no idea where it's going to land. But this is our current approach and we think it works. Let's see how it goes over time, right?
Okay, so on this show I've called the Retro Hour. I'm trying to not go over an hour of interview, so and I think we've approached most of the main points. So well, I just want to say thank you very much for allowing me to interview and for talking a little bit about the archive. And I
Yeah,
hope.
no worries. Thank you.
Mm,
It's
thank,
awesome.
thank you so much.